Okay, so this is now video number 4. I have set the backdrop for the works of Moses in general. I've put Moses' time frame in the 1500s to 1400s BC. In particular, the Exodus itself happened in the year 1445 or 1446 BC. I'm not going to get too fussy about the particular year, because that's just a matter of counting. Remember, their years didn't start on January 1st like ours do. As far as years and archaeology goes, I'll cover that kind of as we go. I'm not going to give, I could sit here and give lesson after lesson after lesson just about that. I don't really want to do that. So we'll just kind of incorporate that into the lessons as I go, which is how I do it whenever I read through the Bible anyway. So 1445, 1446 BC, that's when the Exodus happened. Moses lives on 40 or so. I mean, they spend a year at their camp, 40-ish years. Let's say he dies around 1405 BC, and the Israelites go into the land. It takes them a while to conquer and settle on the land, and we'll say that happens approximately 1400 or so BC. That's about the time they get into the land. But Genesis happens all before that. So now we have to settle the issue of where did Genesis come from. Well, I believe that Moses wrote Genesis. I said that earlier. I believe he wrote it at the time they were wandering in the wilderness during those 40 years in between their first and second attempts to take the land. I believe he wrote it as a history for his people. Now you have to, here is where, and I said this in the beginning video. Actually, I think it was the second video, whichever one of the ones I've already done. Here is where the study of context becomes really important. Because you have to understand who Moses is writing to and the circumstances in which he is writing. Moses is writing to a community of nomads that are wandering around in the wilderness for a period of years until they're all doomed to die, basically, including Moses himself. He's not going to get into the land either. And they have this tent. By this point in time, I believe the tabernacle had already been built. I believe that all the preparations we see them make at the second half of Exodus has already, I believe that's already happened. I believe they're already familiar with that. The creation and establishment of the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant, and and the priestly robes and the table and the lampstand and all the stuff that they built and used as part of their tabernacle, and in the dedication itself. Then in Leviticus, we actually see the story of the dedication of the tabernacle, and I believe that all would have already happened at the time that Moses wrote Genesis. They had this moving tent. They would go places. The Spirit of God would lead them from one location to another, and they would stay there for a period of time, and then when God told them to pack up, they'd pack up and move on. And Moses had a tent, and when he would come out of this tent, he would share with them whatever God had told them recently. We'll see this as we go, as we get into these sections later on. I believe at some point during this time, he wrote down the account of Genesis, which is the history of their people up to the moment in time in which they were currently living. So sometime in the second half of the 1400s BC, from the time they left Egypt and left Sinai, I believe tried to go into the promised land and failed and were rebuffed, and then spent the rest of their years wandering the desert. I believe Moses wrote down Genesis, and he's writing it specifically to a group of people who are supposed to take that land. That land was promised to them when God came to Abraham and said he was going to give it to him and his descendants forever. Okay, and that is the people that Moses is speaking to. So as we read Genesis, and I'm going to mention this, but as we read Genesis, you have to try to put yourself in the mindset here. And here's kind of the key to understanding Genesis. Put yourself in the mindset of a Jewish man. He's writing to the men of a Jewish man, of a Hebrew man. There really weren't such things as Jews at that time. That was a term that came along later. Of a Hebrew man, an ex-slave, who has been wandering in the wilderness. You were born in slavery, and your father was probably in slavery, depending on the timeline of the slavery itself. But you were definitely born in slavery. You've only known slavery, or now this wandering. You've been told by your dad or your granddad or whoever else is in your family that kept this memory alive that there's a land waiting for you that was promised to you on oath to your forefathers by God. Not just one of the Egyptian gods, but by God, the God of gods, Elohim, the God of all gods. Moses is your leader, and you don't particularly like him. There are times when you get very frustrated with him, but he's trying to take you to this land for you to inhabit it. You try to take the land. Well, you first of all, you went up to the land to scout it out. You didn't take it. You showed lack of faith in your God, your Elohim, your God of gods. Then you try to take it on your own without his help, and that didn't work. So now you're condemned to die in the wilderness, and it's going to be your son that takes the land. And so Moses is coming out of his tent, and he has this scroll that he has spent who knows how long writing. He's got some sort of history he wants to read. And so he's gathered you all here in a big group, and he's reading out this scroll. And what he wants to emphasize to you is that that land is your land. The people who are living in that land are supposed to be subjugated to you. That land was promised to you generations ago when God, or the God, your God of gods, made a covenant with your forefather Abraham. And so what remains is for you or your son to go in and take the land. As we read Genesis, over and 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 over, it's going to be emphasized that that land is their land. Okay, we're going to see this mentioned repeatedly. And it's easy for us in our modern mindset to gloss over that. That land doesn't mean anything to us today. It's just land. Okay, that land promise that was so specific and so important to those people is not important to us today at all, apart from a special subject of study. I've never been to that land. I don't think I'll ever go to that land. The land has no meaning or value to me personally. Never has, never will. That covenant that God made with Abraham was specific to those people at that point in time. He never made such a covenant with me or anybody in the church today, for that matter. And so the land itself is now just land. But to them, that land was everything. That was their inheritance. It was their touchstone of their promises. It was the basis of their relationship with God. And so they failed to take it the first time due to their lack of faith. And so Moses, who is constantly reprimanding them for their lack of faith, is going to be reading them this history, demonstrating to them that that land is their land, and that it's supposed to be theirs, and that one day will be theirs, in the days probably of their sons, since I'm assuming this is being written originally to the generation of people who died in the wilderness. That's the important thing you have to remember. Genesis was not written to us today to explain where the universe came from. Okay? We want to make it into that, but that is not what it was written for. Moses is not coming out of his tent. Think again. Put yourself in the mindset of one of those Jewish men who are, again, Hebrew men. I keep using the word Jewish, but that term didn't come along until much later. You're in one of the, put yourself in the mindset of one of those ex-slaves that fled Egypt. You don't have enough you didn't have enough confidence in yourself or your God to go in and actually fight for the land that was supposed to be yours. So now you're just kind of wandering in the wilderness waiting to die. And your sons are going to take the land instead someday. And Moses is coming out of his tent. In his hand he's got the fresh, brand new, hot off the presses, first time anywhere in the world copy of Genesis that he's going to read. Now much of this stuff would be stuff that you already know, because much of this stuff would be stuff that's family history, traditions passed from father to son, mother to daughter, that you would all basically be familiar with. But pay attention as you sit and listen, as you're putting yourself in the mindset of one of those early generation Hebrew men, ex-slaves, who are coming out of the wilderness, who are coming out of Egypt, wandering in the wilderness. And notice how many times Moses talks about that land as being yours. This land I promise, he says, God, I promise. God says, I promise I'm going to give it to you and your descendants forever. It happens over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. And those are the people that Moses is speaking to. He's not speaking to you or me today, sitting here in the 21st century AD, 3,600 years later, on the other side of the world, living under a different covenant that Moses knew nothing about. I said in one of my previous videos, I read out of Deuteronomy 29:29, the secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things revealed belong to us and our children forever. Well, God revealed some things to Moses, but he has revealed many things to human beings after Moses. We know more about the revelation of God now than Moses did. Moses had no idea that the covenant that the covenant of Jesus Christ is going to come. He may have pointed to, we read in the New Testament about the prophets of old not knowing what they were talking about, having some vague understanding that God was going to do something, but not knowing what it was going to be. God kept his plan a secret from everybody until he actually did it. So Moses doesn't know about this new covenant that's coming along 1,500 years later. He certainly doesn't know about you or me sitting here 2,000 years even after that, on the other side of the world, speaking a totally different language, with a cultural context and backdrop that would be completely different from his. He's not writing to you or me about this. When he writes Genesis 1, for example, he is not seeking to explain to us, he's not giving us a technical manual for how God made the universe. And if we attempt to make it that, then we're completely misreading it and wasting our time, actually. Like, there's no sense in doing that. Doesn't benefit anyone, doesn't accomplish anything, and is only going to create frustration and make a conflict out of something that doesn't need to be made a conflict. We're going to be creating a conflict between us and the world that doesn't need to be there. If we understand that Moses is originally writing to that first generation of Hebrew ex-slaves coming out of Egypt, to demonstrate to them that that land is their land, and that that land is the basis of their covenant relationship with their God. Another major thing that Moses is doing, and you have to remember, these are people who had a background of Egyptian slavery, and were familiar with the Egyptian religious system and the Egyptian gods. In fact, they had become Egyptianized. While they were in Egypt, they became Egyptianized. It's one of the reasons why God allowed the Egyptians to conquer them in the first place and make them into slaves. God had a longer view, and we'll get into all this as we go through it. But the Hebrews, while they were in Egypt, became Egyptianized, and they had to be scrubbed clean of that Egyptian influence. Moses himself was an Egyptian prince for 40 years. Now, I don't know necessarily if Moses ever believed in the Egyptian gods, or at least to the exclusion of the Hebrew God, but he certainly knew about them. And so he is attempting to prove to the Hebrews, and really honestly to the cultures around them even, that their God, the Hebrew God, is the God of gods, is the Elohim, the God of gods, the one that's worth paying attention to the exclusion of all these other gods. So, for example, when we read Genesis 1, Moses is not going to attempt to convince you or me that God made the world. He's just going to take for granted that he did. Okay? Because at the time that Moses is writing, nobody in his audience needed to be convinced that God made the world. Nobody did. Nobody in the ancient world would have needed to be convinced of that. Okay, that is not Moses never in his entire life, all 120 years of it, Moses would have never come across anybody who needed to be convinced that God or the gods made the world. He never even would have encountered anybody who had any other thought. So there is nothing in the text, nothing in Genesis that even attempts to demonstrate the physical proof of God establishing, of making the world. It's just that's not in the basis of the text at all. Moses would never have even come across anybody who had even dreamed to assume otherwise. So, but what Moses is doing is he is attempting to show to his people that their God is the only God they need to bother with. Their God is the God of gods. Elohim really means God of gods, the greatest of gods. And so they don't need to worry about the Egyptian gods which they left behind, or the Canaanite gods, which is where they're going to. Okay, they don't need to worry about those. Those gods are useless. They're impotent. They're made up. They're man's imagination. Whatever. I'm not even necessarily certain that Moses would have thought they were a man's imagination. Now, later prophets will say that. I'm not sure necessarily what Moses thought about that. But he's attempting to demonstrate to the Hebrews that their God is the only God that they need to worry about. They need to pay attention to. The only one they need to worship. The only one they need to show respect for. These other nations' gods are nothing. That's what he's attempting to demonstrate. And we're going to see clues to that deep into the Genesis 1 account. I mean, that's how the entire narrative is framed. Another thing important to remember is that this, I believe, as I said earlier, that this text is being written after they've already been at Sinai, which means after they built the tabernacle, after they've dedicated the tabernacle. And the tabernacle itself was dedicated in a 7-day dedication process, at the end of which God took up residence in the tabernacle. You'll see that at the end of Exodus. I believe at the time that Moses is writing Genesis, at the time he is reading it for the first time to his hearers, to his listeners, they have already experienced that. They've already seen that happen. That's already in their past. So they know that that's part of their cultural shared experience. So Moses is patterning his account of creation off of the dedication of the tabernacle. It's a 7-day process, just the dedication of the tabernacle is, and it ends with God taking up full residence in his creation, in his holy place. It's not necessarily. It's not meant to give us a technical explanation for how God made the world. And we can look into as much as we want and try to match it up as best as we can with what we understand of how the world came together. I'm not going to even refute that or even attempt to. I'm just saying that we're taking two completely separate issues and trying to make them into the same thing, and they're not the same thing. There's no need to do this. There's no reason to do it. It doesn't make any sense to do it. There's no need to make an issue here where none exists or where none need exist.